The reason I mentioned the ability to read is because everyone on the committee I was speaking to probably had the ability to read too. And as such, they also are qualified to discern between truth and error. They can look up the quotes that I provided them. I give them references where they look up the full context. Because any person that has the ability to read can see through the lies. It's like the emperor has no clothes story. The little boy who pointed out the obvious, anyone who's willing to look can also see how obvious the lies are that are being used to push the Article 5 convention.
An organization known as Convention of States is on the attack, attacking constitutional educator Robert Brown about his credentials at a recent hearing in the South Dakota legislature for whether or not South Dakota should apply to Congress for a convention to propose amendments to the Constitution. Joining us today, of course, is Robert Brown to discuss this attack against him and the truth behind an Article 5 convention. Mr. Brown, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So for those that are watching that might not be too familiar with Article 5 and a Convention of States or Constitutional Convention, can you briefly just summarize what that is?
Certainly. So Article 5 is the part of the Constitution where it allows for making amendments, changes to the Constitution as needed. There are two methods outlined in there. We've only ever used the first one. The first one is Congress proposes amendments, passes them with a 2/3 majority vote, then it's sent out to the states, and with a 3/4 majority, the states ratify those changes. That's how all amendments have been passed so far. The unused portion, it describes that when 2/3 of the states' legislatures apply to Congress for a convention, then Congress will call a convention with the power to propose amendments to the Constitution. And so there are various groups around the country, both liberal and conservative, that are proposing various ideas of we need to change this or that about the Constitution to solve our problems. Let's have a constitutional convention, as it's often called, or an Article 5 convention to propose and make those changes to the Constitution. Frankly, I refer to them as the blame the Constitution crowd.
Okay, so recently in South Dakota, there was a resolution that was proposed in the state legislature that was going to apply to Congress to use that second method that's never been used before for the convention that you just explained. Now, you were testified against that resolution. Can you briefly explain why this resolution is a bad idea, and then also why you were attacked by the Convention of States organization that's advocating it, specifically explaining the nature of their attack against you and your credentials?
I could take about an hour or two and explain why it's a bad idea, but in a nutshell, frankly, in today's political environment where the vast majority of Americans are wholly uneducated on what the Constitution says or means, changing the Constitution in that condition is of deep concern. I've seen a lot of proposed amendments out there circulating that would do tremendous damage when they're trying to improve things. One, for example, Convention of States held a mock convention back in 2016. One of the proposals they came up with referred to federal law passed by Congress, the president, or the administrative agencies. Anyone who knows Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution knows that all lawmaking power was vested in Congress. If you have an amendment that's saying president can also create law, you just granted him the power. That wasn't what they were trying to do. They were trying to give the states power to overturn any federal law passed by Congress, the president, and so on. But that just illustrates that in today's political environment of constitutional ignorance, changing the Constitution, I would compare to inviting your grocery store clerk to do heart surgery. They don't know what they're cutting into. They're likely going to kill the patient in the process. This is a very bad circumstance in which to do so. And secondly, the founders never suggested that when the federal government ignores the Constitution, the way to rein them in is to change the Constitution. In fact, Madison devoted Federalist 48 and 49 to rebuke that very idea. I view it as almost like a time capsule letter to Mark Meckler, the founder of Convention of States, because Madison is taking on exactly what Mark Meckler is claiming and saying this is a horrible idea. So Federalist 48 and 49 don't use the convention when they're ignoring the Constitution. You need to enforce the Constitution when they
So would you say that amending the Constitution is really to correct defects in the Constitution and not to fix administrative or legislative problems, such as a Congress that's running away from obeying the Constitution?
Precisely. In fact, every time the founders ever speak of using Article 5, if they give context to it, it's always in that context for correcting errors or defects in the Constitution. But as far as enforcing the Constitution. They give many other solutions and never mention Article 5, changing the Constitution in that context.
Now, Convention of States, they put out an article on their blog, on their website. Anti-COS expert admits he has no credentials except ability to read with regards to your testimony at the South Dakota Legislature. How do you respond to COS's attacks that you have no credentials because you claim that you have the ability to read, and that alone gives you the authority to, I guess, oppose this idea and tell fellow lawmakers to oppose it as well? Could you explain that a bit?
Certainly. Well, first of all, I had to pick myself up off the floor from laughing. That was hilarious how they took one sentence out of context, because right after that, I did go into, while I am known nationally as a nationally known constitutional scholar and lecturer, I produce videos on the Constitution that are in use by thousands all across the nation, yet that is not why you should listen to my testimony. The reason my testimony has merit is because all I'm doing is showing you the historical record. I provided handouts with 18 different citations from the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and surrounding events, proving that every delegate there had the idea that, yeah, we are exceeding our authority. We're stepping outside the bounds. And I issue the challenge repeatedly to Convention of States and other organizations pushing this. Show me the delegate who felt that they actually were acting within their state delegated authority. Who stood up during the convention when the question was raised? Do we have the authority to replace the Articles of Confederation, create a new constitution? They asked that repeatedly, and the question always came back, yeah, we probably don't, but we need to do this anyway. Show me the delegate who said what Mark Meckler is saying, that we have full authority in our delegate commissions. Look, let's read them together. We were authorized to do this. Let's move forward and not worry about it. Nobody said that. That's a modern day historical revisionism designed to push this view. Oh, the 1787 convention wasn't a runaway convention, so therefore, if we have a convention today, there's no need to worry.
So they're trying to whitewash the history of the original convention to make it seem like, well, that was safe. They did what they were supposed to do, when in fact it was a runaway convention, to assuade any fears today that such a convention could also become a runaway convention. Correct?
Precisely. My opening line that they did quote me on, they totally missed what I was referencing as well, that I don't pretend to be an expert. That was a reference to Mark Meckler, who is pretending to be an expert. He's a lawyer. He claims to be an expert because he's a lawyer. Well, my father is a doctor, but I don't recommend you go to my father if you have some health ailments, because he's not that kind of doctor. Well, Mark Meckler's not that type of lawyer. He's a lawyer of business law. He's not a lawyer of constitutional law. And yet his whole argument against me is, trust me, I'm a lawyer. Mr. Brown's not a lawyer. Well, he's not that kind of lawyer. And his entire defense is not, here are the references that I share with you from Madison, from Hamilton, from the convention, whatever else. It's, well, here I have in my hand this article, which this one here, this is written by Michael Ferris. He's a lawyer too. He wrote this 34-page article proving the 1787 convention wasn't a runaway convention. And my response in the legislative hearings was, you know what, I have that article right here with me, and guess what it doesn't have? It doesn't have that delegate I'm asking about. Show me the delegate who believed what they're saying, that they had full authority and that they weren't running away. That article does a great job of working around the issue with never answering that issue.
So since COS seems to take issue with you having the ability to read as being your credential to understand the Constitution, in your estimation, what would you say are the credentials necessary to properly interpret the Constitution? Does everyone need to become a lawyer to understand the Constitution?
Being a lawyer doesn't tend to teach you much or anything about the Constitution. It teaches case law. To really understand the Constitution, you need to read the works of the founders themselves. You need to read, for example, Madison's notes on the Federal Convention of 1787, where you get a play-by-play of, if we include this wording in the Constitution, here's what it'll mean. Followed by reading the Federalist Papers, which were designed to explain, if you implement and ratify this new Constitution, here's how it will work. Both of those documents have been looked to for our 200-plus history of our nation now in the courts as official explanation of the meaning of the Constitution. So if you want to know what it really was meant, read the Federalist Papers, read Madison's notes. The reason I mentioned the ability to read is because everyone on the committee I was speaking to probably had the ability to read too. And as such, they also are qualified to discern between truth and error. They can look up the quotes that I provided them. I give them references where they look up the full context. Because any person that has the ability to read can see through the lies. It's like the emperor has no clothes story. The little boy who pointed out the obvious, anyone who's willing to look can also see how obvious the lies are that are being used to push the Article 5 Convention. If you simply take the time to read, if you read the references that I provide, if you read theirs, which they don't tend to provide much, if anything, you'll quickly see that the evidence stands on its own. I don't need to have some trust me, I'm a lawyer claim. Instead, it's trust your own eyes, trust the references that I've given you, and know for yourself what the truth is, rather than just blind trust in someone who claims to be an expert.
Absolutely. Also, going back to the COS article in which they go against you here, this article is pretty short, but it doesn't mention anywhere in the article what your testimony was in opposition to the South Dakota application to Congress for a Convention of States constitutional convention. So why do you think COS doesn't refer to the substance of your testimony? It's the only part they quote is the part where you just said the part about how you have the ability to read it. That's all they say, as if that's all you said. I'm sure you said more than that.
I'm sure it was just an oversight on their part. I ought to submit to them my full testimony so they can include all the 18 references from the convention and thereafter that I provided, because, they'd want to surely show a fair and balanced approach, right? I'm being a little facetious here, but of course, the evidence stands on its own, and so therefore they're not going to put out that evidence. They never will. They never do. The evidence refutes them, and there's a real problem, especially Mark Meckler has here. I have publicly challenged him for almost 2 years now to a debate, and he has publicly refused repeatedly. In a legislative hearing, I get my say, they get their say, and it's over. There's no back and forth. There's no, he claimed this, but here's the truth behind what he claims. He took this quote out of context. Here's the context. In that situation, I'd destroy him, and he knows it. And
Would you still welcome a debate with Mark Meckler today if he were to offer it to you?
Absolutely. But he knows that he has nothing to gain by a debate because he wouldn't be able to win. If he could win, he could shut me down, and that would likely help it pass in a lot of the states that I've been able to get it to stop. But on the other hand, if he loses, he puts at risk his $250,000 a year salary that his organization is paying him. This whole movement that he's pushing could get shut down if he loses this debate, which he would. And so I don't anticipate he would ever do so, but I'm still pushing. I would love to have that opportunity because the evidence speaks for itself. And frankly, part of my passion for this is I love to bring truth forward. I love to expose those who are trying to manipulate and deceive. And I feel like that's very clearly what he's doing. Ignore the evidence. Robert Brown's not a lawyer. That's his approach. That's his whole argument against me.
And of course, Convention of States also makes the claim that a convention is the only method that can be used right now to solve all the problems that are going on in our country today. We have Biden in the White House, Kamala Harris as vice president. We have Schumer and the Democrats in control of the Senate, Pelosi in the House of Representatives. So the situation looks rather bleak as when we look at the federal government. So what solutions would you say can be states should do or individuals should consider when it comes to stopping the runaway government we have at the federal level, but not going the route of a convention that also could become runaway, since many of the same people in the establishment who control the Democrat and Republican Party that have us where we are today would likely be the same delegates, you could correct me if I'm wrong, at a convention today. So what are the proper solutions that we should consider?
I always advocate, why don't we try what the founders actually told us to do? For the constitutional nerds out there, the scholars, people who want some detail here, I'm a huge advocate of evidence. So I'm going to just briefly reference several Federalist papers, but what they say is, number one, Federalist 43, Madison talks about using the Article 5 Convention for correcting errors, like you'd mentioned before, for correcting errors in the Constitution. Federalist 48 and 49, should we use it for reining in the federal government when they ignore? Absolutely not. That's what those are about. But then if you get into Federalist 16, 26, 33, 44, and 46, they go into efforts that we the people and we the states should do to rein in and to enforce the Constitution, to rein in the federal government when they're violating it. Federalist 33, for example, Hamilton there talks about when the federal government exercises powers that were not granted in the Constitution, these are merely acts of usurpation and should be and deserve to be treated as such. Federalist 16, Hamilton talks about the states refusing to implement unconstitutional law. Federalist 46, that we the people have power to push back. All of these come into really two categories: the power that we the people have and the power that the states have. And on the state level, we're seeing a number of bills being introduced that really are, you might consider nullification type bills. I saw one just a couple of weeks ago in North Dakota saying they're going to assign their state attorney general to review presidential executive orders for their constitutional authority. And if they don't have the authority, make recommendations to the state accordingly. That's one bill that's circulating right now in North Dakota. There's one in South Dakota proposing to establish a legislative committee that reviews federal law and makes recommendations to the state, whether or not they should have any obligation to follow such law, that kind of thing. So these are the types of solutions the founders actually told the states and the people to do when the federal government ignores the Constitution. Instead of that, people like Convention of States, Mark Meckler, have made up this fiction of, they told us the only solution is to change the Constitution when they ignore it. That's not even true. They never said that. Let's use the solutions the founders actually told us to use.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Brown. We appreciate your time with us today. Take care. God bless you. Stay safe. And of course, best of luck as you are on your travels educating many legislators and the American people as well about the dangers of a convention and the true nature of the Constitution. Thank you so much.